So good evening, everyone. I'm Martha Tedeschi, Director of the Harvard Art Museums, and it is my very great pleasure to welcome you tonight to the Sardis Biennial Lecture. This series of lectures was established over 50 years ago to present new excavation finds and current research from the Archaeological Exploration of Sardis. 2023 marks the 66th consecutive year of excavation. May we have an applause for that number? So the 66th consecutive year of excavation at the ancient site of Sardis in western Türkiye, making it one of the longest ongoing archaeological projects in the Mediterranean basin, as well as one of the longest international projects sponsored by Harvard. Started in 1958 with permission of the Turkish government, the Archaeological Exploration of Sardis, also known as the Sardis Expedition, was founded by the late George M.A. Hanfin, professor of archaeology in the Department of Fine Arts and Classics at Harvard, and also curator of ancient art at Harvard's Fogg Art Museum, together with Henry Detweiler, who was then the Dean of Architecture of the Architecture School at Cornell University. Tonight, I would like to extend a very special welcome to Turkish Consul General Murat Orluoğlu. The Consul General's office in Boston has been of invaluable assistance in supporting our research through the facilitation of research visas for team members each year, and we thank them for their partnership and friendship. I am delighted now to introduce my colleague and our expedition administrator for the Archaeological Exploration of Sardis, Baha Yildirim, who will introduce this evening's speaker, Nicholas D. Cahill. Baha, please join me.
Good evening. Merhabalar. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge that Harvard University is located on the traditional and ancestral land of the Massachusetts, the original inhabitants of what is now known as Boston and Cambridge. We pay respect to the people of the Massachusetts tribe, past and present, and honor the land itself, which remains sacred to the Massachusetts people. We also would like to acknowledge the plight of all the communities devastated by the recent earthquakes in southeastern Türkiye and northern Syria, and express our deepest condolences to them as we support ongoing efforts around the world, including at Harvard, to help them. Such unfortunate times make us recognize how entangled we are in our humanity. The proverb, "It takes a village to raise a child," certainly rings true for Sardis. Our administrative headquarters in the research facility of the Harvard Art Museums in Somerville is where I work closely with remarkable colleagues that you see here to facilitate the research, publication, education. You see them here, and our education and training programs for students who are involved with the Sardis expedition. This year, undergraduate and graduate students from Harvard will join over 80 students, scholars, and specialists in disciplines such as anthropology, classics, engineering, and geophysics. This international team, of which over half are from Turkish universities from Izmir, Ankara, and Istanbul, will originate from 12 countries, reaching from Bolivia to China. They will work closely with more than 80 local specialists from Sardis and its neighboring communities. As we prepare for each excavation season, our office works closely with the museum's departments, as well as Harvard's Faculty Oversight Committee for the Sardis Expedition and its Office of the Vice Provost of International Affairs, along with our Turkish partners, most notably at the Ministry of Culture and Tourism, along with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And I'd like to reiterate Consul General Murat Orluoğlu and his office, the wonderful support that they've given us each year for the issuance of the research visas and our annual excavation permit. Çok teşekkürler. Thank you. Tonight's speaker, Nicholas Cahill, is one of the key figures in this village that supports Sardis. Nick is professor of art history at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He has an appointment at the Harvard Art Museums as research manager and has been directing the Sardis expedition since 2008. That was the time when he took over from the much beloved and late director of Sardis, Crawford Greenwald Jr., you see in the middle here. And here you see the succession of directors since George Hoffman started in 1958. Beyond the ancient site of Sardis, Nick had excavated sites in the UK, Israel, and Greece before he graduated with his doctorate from the University of California at Berkeley in 1991. His extensive experience in Türkiye led to his appointment as the vice president of the American Research Institute in Turkey from 2010 to 2015. And his research has been supported by many institutions, including the American Council of Learned Societies, National Endowment of the Humanities, and he has been awarded major grants for preservation of the site of Sardis from the Kaplan Fund and the U.S. Embassy at Ankara. Soon after Nick appeared on the scene at Sardis in 1979 as an archaeologist and photographer, he became involved in major discoveries which have shaped his research trajectory, most notably the destruction levels of the sack of Sardis by the Persian King Cyrus in 547 BCE, which included Lydian domestic assemblages and Lydian coinage. His numerous published articles, excavation reports, and edited volumes in English and Turkish include the exhibition catalog Lidyalılar ve Dünyaları, Lydians and Their World, and focus on the cultural relationships between the Mediterranean and Near East during the Iron Age, Greek and Near Eastern urbanism, and the archaeology of households. His research has been critical to our understanding of Lydian urbanism and domestic context, as well as the origin of coinage. And his dissertation, published as the monograph Household and City Organization of Olinthos by Yale University Press in 2002, is a landmark in studies of households and antiquity, and an important model for the publication of legacy excavation data. That's important. He has continued at Sardis his pioneering digital humanities talents. He gained as project curator of the Perseus Project at Harvard University in 1991 and 93. He's developed a research database and website which has enormously facilitated research and publication. During his 15-year tenure as director, he has helped steward to completion 8 major site publications, which are also available on our bilingual Turkish-English website. Nick has a profound curiosity and is a great student in everything, a humanist in the truest sense, vital for directing an archaeological project combining so many disciplines, people, and animals. To name only a few of the many hats he wears, he is an IT specialist, a photographer, architectural consultant, a driver, a conservator, a recorder, an editor, veterinarian, a cook, a drone pilot, a mentor, a puppy whisperer, and first responder always ready to lend a hand. He's always there when you need him. And Nick, you embody the vision of the museums, guiding us through your curiosity, collaboration, and continuous learning. Thank you for being everything, everywhere, all at once to us. So let us invite Nick to the podium to present on Sardis Biennial, Lecture 2021-22.
Well, thank you, Baha, for that wonderful introduction. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be here in Cambridge after this long pandemic and to try to fill you in on some of our work at Sardis. Since then, I'm particularly grateful to Martha Tedeschi, the director of the Harvard Art Museums, to Mark Elliott, Adrian Staley, Paul Kosman, Rowan Flaw, Jason Ur, and the other members of the faculty committee for Sardis, and particularly to the Ministry of Culture and Tourism of the Republic of Türkiye, and for all the help, as Baha and Martha have said, that their consulate has given us for many years. And Consul General Murat Urluoğlu is here tonight, and I want to express my thanks again to him for the third time. Also to Baha, of course, and as anybody who knows, who's worked at Sardis knows, he's the great driving force behind really everything we do. Not only an extraordinary mind and eye for ancient sculpture and inscriptions and buildings, but also he finds joins between sculpture pieces found decades apart and hundreds of meters apart, noticing pock marks left by iconoclasts who destroyed that enormous head of Commodus. But he's not your usual clueless academic either, but can balance spreadsheets and budgets with professional accountants and deal with a range of crises that afflict any big project, and do so with interlanguage puns that has everybody rolling on the floor. So everybody looks forward to his arrival at Sardis each year. And finally, I want to thank the hundreds of students and scholars and professionals who have worked at Sardis over the last 66 years, and the generations of local Sardians who have worked with the expedition there and made this research possible. Sardis was one of the great cities of the ancient world, the home of famous kings like Alyattes and Gyges and Croesus, the motherland of the Etruscans in Italy, according to some sources, and one of the seven churches of Asia. It's located in western Türkiye, about an hour's drive in from Izmir in the foothills of the Tmolus Mountains, and a site, as you see, of great natural beauty. The cliffs of the Acropolis gleaming golden in the morning or afternoon light, rising high above the fertile green plains. In antiquity, Sardis was prized for many natural resources, its fertility, its forests, its impregnable citadel, the Acropolis, and the Pactolus River burbled by the site, and above all else brought Sardis fame because it ran rich with alluvial gold, making the inhabitants, the Lydians, the wealthiest people in the world, and the inventors of the first coins. The gold ran out, but Sardis's fame as the golden city was never lost. Let me give a very brief history, repetitive to many of you, I know, but focusing on some of the particular problems that occupy our research. First, who were the Lydians? In about 668 BC, Ashurbanipal, the king of Assyria in Iraq, the most powerful man in the world, received an embassy at his capital at Nineveh. The stranger spoke a language that nobody could understand, but he finally explained that he'd come from Lydia, and they were threatened by nomadic horsemen from Central Asia called the Cimmerians. The Lydian king Gyges offered submission to the Assyrian king that would if he would help repel the invaders. In the end, the diplomacy led nowhere, the Assyrians sent no aid, and the Cimmerians swept through the land and Gyges was killed. At just about this same time, one of the earliest Greek poets, Archilochus, boasted that he did not care for the wealth of Gyges rich in gold. This is a common conceit or trope or something among the Greeks who claim to be above mere lucre and to value friendship over coin. But Gyges did dedicate at the Greek sanctuary of Delphi 6 mixing bowls weighing 780 kilograms of gold. These two earliest literary sources illustrate the position of Lydia between East and West. To the Assyrians, the Lydians were a distant people beyond the western limits of civilization, speaking an incomprehensible language, not worth sending an army all that way to support. To the Greeks, on the other hand, the Lydians were these prototypical Oriental monarchs, living in unimaginable luxury, famous for delicately woven headbands and exotic foods, extraordinary generosity, and an unstoppable cavalry. The Lydians also stand at that border between history and prehistory. Gyges in the 7th century BC is the first historical Lydian we know of. The geographer Strabo tells us that Sardis didn't even exist until after the Trojan War, about 1200 BC, which is relatively late in the history of Anatolia. Although, as we'll see, Strabo was wrong. For the period between, say, 1200 and 680, we have only these weird, fabulous stories about the Heraclid dynasty. Queen Omphale enslaved Heracles and made him wear women's clothes while she wore his lion skin and club. A wonderful reversal of gender roles, encapsulating the Greeks' attitudes towards the Lydians as, on the one hand, effeminate and also powerful enough to overcome the Greeks. but it's not history. Herodotus and other historians tell us that Gyges founded a dynasty that ruled Sardis for 5 generations, and that under the series of kings, Sardis came to rule all of western Turkey, conquering the Greeks along the coast, the Phrygians in central Anatolia, and everybody in between. They became players in international politics. Gyges sent troops to Egypt to help their revolt against Assyria. They drove the Cimmerians from Asia. They established political and dynastic ties with Greeks and Iranians. They became great patrons of Greek sanctuaries, including the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus, one of the 7 wonders of the world, later, most of whose columns were dedicated by Croesus, the last king of Sardis. Croesus also dedicated more than 8 tons of gold at Delphi. And because it will be relevant later, I might mention now that we know, or we thought we knew, the exact dates of this last king. He was overthrown in 547 BC, and Herodotus tells us that he ruled for only 14 years, so he must have come, according to that chronology, to the throne about 561. So his dedication at Ephesus, for instance, is one of the ways that scholars used to date that famous temple. Sardis became famous as golden because, as I say, the Pactolus River flowing by the ancient city ran rich with natural gold. Legend had it that King Midas, when he realized that the golden touch was not all it was cracked up to be, came to Sardis to wash away that golden curse. And from that time on, the gold panned from the Pactolus made the Lydians the richest people in the world. This is connected in some way with the Lydians inventing coinage, probably during the reign of Gyges, or perhaps during the reign of Gyges, in the middle, or roughly in the middle years of the 7th century BC. This technology changed the world forever, but like so much else at Sardis, it's not quite as simple as taking the gold from the Pactolus and making coins out of it. These earliest coins, just as a digression here, because we'll see later, were struck in electrum, about 54% gold, 46% silver, and in many different sizes, from a full stater of about 14 grams to tiny coins the size of the head of a pin, weighing only 0.07 grams, a quarter of an aspirin tablet. People have assumed since the 19th century that electrum was a natural ore from the Pactolus River. But a few years ago, we discovered that the gold in the Pactolus River was actually pure, not mixed with silver. And instead, it may be that the electrum came from outside Lydia proper, mines in northwest Anatolia, which the Lydians conquered in the 7th century BC as they expanded their empire. So I become sort of interested in this relationship between Lydian imperialism and Lydian coinage, and so forth. This idea soon caught on, and hundreds of other authorities, Greek and Anatolian, soon minted coins in electrum. In the 6th century BC, the Lydians changed their coinage from electrum to a bimetallic system of pure gold and pure silver, with a lion and bull on the front. These are called cresids, and it was a profound transformation, perhaps mainly because the earlier coinage was apparently overvalued in relation to the metal in them, sort of a token currency, so that they were really only used within the area where the Lydian kings could guarantee their value. The pure gold and silver coins, on the other hand, were worth as much as the pure gold and silver in them, and so could be used for international trade outside the region of Lydian control. The coins were known, as I say, as cresids, and their invention is attributed to the last king, Croesus, the patron of so many Greek sanctuaries. We have some new cresids from our excavations, so I wanted to make this digression here. With all this gold and power, the Lydian kings monumentalized their city, and creating immense terraces in the city center and encircling the city with a fortification 20 meters, 65 feet thick, and still standing 15 meters high, 3.5 kilometers long. The masonry of the terraces is quite similar to Greek masonry of that time, like at the Temple of Artemis. But the mud brick wall, on the other hand, is completely based on Near Eastern prototypes, so the Lydians use architectural traditions from both East and West. Across the valley from Sardis, they built an elite cemetery of monumental tumulus tombs called Bintepe, 1,000 mounds, although there's really only about 120 to 150 of them. The largest of these is the tumulus of Aliates, which is described by Herodotus as the greatest structure ever built, apart from those of the Egyptians and Babylonians. It's 360 meters in diameter, or more than half again as large as the Great Pyramid of Egypt. And this sort of crudely overlaid image of the Great Pyramid gives a sense of the scale that Herodotus is describing. The pyramid is twice as tall and built of stone, of course, but it's still a big pile of dirt. And I'll mention that we hope to begin a new project there in the coming years. Maybe the most famous event in Lydian history is the end of the empire. In about 550 BC, a new king, Cyrus, was on the rise in Persia, and Croesus, the king of Lydia, hoped to add territory to his empire, and so he asked the oracle at Delphi whether he should attack Cyrus. The oracle famously and ambiguously answered that if he did, he would destroy a great empire, so Croesus set out, but was defeated by the Persian king and his city captured and burned, and so fulfilled the oracle by destroying his own empire. We've uncovered dramatic remains of the sack of Sardis, houses burned, soldiers slaughtered and left in the rubble, the fortification demolished. These destructive events are wonderful for archaeologists since they preserve so many wonderful artifacts. We get a detailed look at the lives of ordinary people, interrupted so suddenly that we find cooking pots on the hearths still filled with grain. Or we find the soldiers, in this case, a soldier who wore a heavy iron helmet for long enough that it compressed the vertebrae of his neck. He was found with a tiny 24th stater near his head. What happened next when the Lydians were no longer masters of their world but part of a larger empire? We always assumed that Sardis continued as it did before, but under new management, that the Persians moved into the palace of Croesus and ruled from there. But the archaeological record gives a very different story. It turns out that the city center was almost entirely abandoned. Here you see, for instance, a Lydian house on the left, destroyed by Cyrus in 547 BC. The next activity on this spot was 350 years later when the Hellenistic theater was built in the intervening centuries. Although this was a major regional capital with a powerful governor and a strong garrison, the ancient city lay fallow. Although no historical source documents this, we've seen this pattern over and over everywhere we've dug, and I kind of have to believe it. Alexander the Great took Sardis in 334 BC, and the city center was reoccupied and transformed from a Persian capital to a Greek polis. Monumental buildings, maybe a Hellenistic palace at this western capital of the Seleucid Empire, were built from blocks scavenged or salvaged from the Lydian structures. The greatest monument of this period is the Temple of Artemis, which was the subject of another research project lasting for more than 30 years. And Fikret Yegul drew every marble block of the temple, wrote a wonderful and detailed account of this magnificent building. And after these decades of research and writing, his 2-volume report was finally published in 2020. Sardis joined the Roman Empire in 133 BC, but a profound change in the city comes only a century and a half later. Sardis was located, as I say, on a fertile, defensible spot, but the site has disadvantages like being located directly on a major fault line. In 17 AD, a devastating earthquake struck the city, but the Sardians rebuilt with the help of the imperial purse. I'll talk about this more later. Among the public projects were the stadium, a reconstruction of the theater, an enormous bath gymnasium complex, a monumental arch at the entrance of the city, which is now just a pile of rubble, and a sanctuary of the imperial cult exactly in the center of the city with a huge temple lavishly decorated with relief and freestanding sculpture and ornament. Again, more later. Later in the Roman era, the temple was dismantled and its remains built into new buildings on the spot, one of many cases where the Sardians recycled their own past. And this is another of our major research projects, the later days of the city when the world was undergoing dramatic changes from the pagan world of imperial Rome to the Christian world of Byzantium. Sardis flourished in this late Roman period. The city had a large and important Jewish population, and in the 4th century, they converted part of the Bath Gymnasium complex into a synagogue, the largest in the ancient world, paved with colorful mosaics and the walls covered with marble revetment. The synagogue was discovered, as we again will see, in 1962 and restored during the next 10 years, and we've returned to this remarkable building recently. These buildings are preserved for us, ironically, because they were destroyed by another earthquake in the early 7th century. Roofs and walls collapsed, leaving the inhabitants crushed in the ruins. Buildings around the site tumbled like dominoes. And after this earthquake, there was no sign of major urban rebuilding in the lower city. After thriving for millennia, Sardis was no longer a city. Again, we're learning more about the little-known late phase in these years. The site remained important, and in the early Byzantine period, the inhabitants fortified the Acropolis, hauling these blocks from the wrecked ancient buildings up the steep slope to build these tremendous fortifications. And we're beginning a new project, or we have begun one, to understand Sardis in this post-antique period. With this enormous site, with such a wealth of history and monuments, where should archaeologists begin to work? And I should mention that we're not the first to dig at Sardis. Howard Crosby Butler of Princeton University led an expedition there in 1910 and 1914, and again in 1922. Their focus was on the Temple of Artemis, which they completely uncovered in 4 heroic years, and the Lydian cemeteries, which we'll return to later. In 1958, the founder of the present expedition, Professor Hanfmann of Harvard, returned to Sardis and took on an amazing range of projects, from excavation, for the first time at the city center itself and in Bintepe, to the restoration of the Bath Gymnasium complex and the synagogue, the first such large-scale restoration project in Turkey. His wide range of interests and long vision are what made this project such a success. At such a complicated site, you can't just focus on one thing, but must take advantage of and enjoy the time span and the range and the complexity of the site. When Professor Hanfmann retired in 1976, Professor Greenwald of Berkeley took over and directed the site for the next 32 years. One thing that drew Hanfmann and Butler and Greenwald to Sardis, though, was the Lydians. For while there's lots of important Hellenistic and Roman sites, Sardis is the only Lydian city, the capital of these people who invented coinage, ruled Anatolia, and bridged east and west. I don't want to diminish the later phases, of course, but Hanfmann had his eyes on Lydian Sardis. With regard to the Lydian city, though, he was sort of unwittingly laboring under a misapprehension. He followed Herodotus' description of Sardis in 499 BC, which was a ragtag scatter of houses along the Pactolus River, unfortified and mostly made of reeds. He didn't know about that historically undocumented depopulation of the urban core, or realized that Sardis in 499 BC was a completely different settlement from the imperial capital under Croesus 50 years earlier. So he concluded that Sardis was this dispersed settlement based on his excavations, where he found important Lydian material at Pactolus North, the House of Bronzes, and other sites. And I'll mention that the final publication of some of these excavations were just published in 2021. It fell to the next director, Professor Greenwald, to discover that colossal fortification wall, 20 meters wide, so large that Hanfmann had dug right across the street from it for 30 years and thought that it was a natural hill. I mean, everybody had. Greeny then proved that it was not the east wall of a city along the Pactolus, but rather the west wall of a city north of the Acropolis, under the Hellenistic and Roman cities, and that the sectors where Professor Hanfmann had dug for almost 20 years were outside the Lydian city. So our main focus in recent years has been the Lydian city center, the whole Lydian city center, the core of the city from the Lydian to Roman period. That is here. I want to start then with an artificial terrace exactly in the middle of the ancient city, known as Field 55. Today, it's just an olive orchard, but in the early Roman period, it was the sanctuary of the imperial cult dating to the middle of the 1st century AD, part of a larger complex that included the stadium and theater. The temple was a lavish structure with sculpted figural column capitals, a figural frieze. We found Corinthian capitals from the temple decorated with these human and animal figures, and blocks of its architrave with cuttings for an inscription in gilded bronze letters, now missing. Hundreds of architectural blocks, fragments of sculpture, and inscriptions, giving us a remarkable picture of this expensive temple and the dedications by prominent Sardian citizens and groups. These neocorate temples, that is, temples that are built and paid for, not just by the city of Sardis, but by the whole Roman province of Asia, were a great honor, and cities of the Roman Empire competed fiercely for the privilege of having such a temple. This would have been a jewel in Sardis's crown. Almost nothing of the temple survives in situ, though. One of Sardis's most important sanctuaries, it was deliberately dismantled in the 4th century AD, and its fragments were then reused in late Roman constructions on the east side of the terrace, and so that's where our work has been mostly. A huge wall built out of inscribed statue bases and sculptures from the temple and other buildings was maybe a late Roman fortification and gate dating to the late 5th and early 6th century AD. You see that here. The sanctuary terrace was then converted into luxurious houses, and in previous lectures here I've reported on some of the remarkable finds from the southern house, collections of iron swords and bronze weights and pottery and glass and other artifacts, rooms with beautifully painted walls, a sort of a late Roman Pompeii. Our work in the last 2 years, though, is focused on the house to the north, and in particular on a marble-paved courtyard that must have formed the focus of this house. Here we find no artifacts scattered on the floor. The house seems to have been abandoned before it was destroyed. The room was still standing, though. We found columns, as you see, from the central colonnade, toppled into the middle of the court. And as so often in late Roman houses, the columns were built from recycled pieces from various buildings, one Ionic and one Corinthian capital, with this wonderful eclectic diversity. The walls were painted to look like brightly colored marble revetment, very much like one of the rooms to the south. The marble pavement of the floor is mostly well preserved, and in the middle of the courtyard, circular designs were carved into the pavement, identified as gaming boards, because they've been found in pavements of streets and buildings throughout the Roman Empire. Excavation in 2021 and 2022 revealed the western and the northern sides of these courtyard, which were very badly plundered for reasons I'll come back to in a moment. And we also got really important deposits from under the courtyard floor, which suggests that the house was constructed in the second half of the 4th century AD, satisfyingly close to the date of the destruction of the temple. So they move almost immediately, move the houses in. This period from, say, 360 to 400 or so saw remarkable transformations of the city, not just the demolition of one of the city's most important pagan temples, but also the construction of the synagogue, Church E, A, and Church M in the Temple of Artemis, a major transformation in the religious life of the city. You may notice here that crack in the earth and in the wall and pavements which runs from one side of the court to the other, and also the way the columns all collapse towards the east. This is the remnants, as I mentioned, of a tremendous earthquake that shattered the house, bringing down the roof, toppling the columns of the portico, and splitting the earth beneath to some unknown depth. And I want to stop for a moment to acknowledge and grieve the terrible loss of life, the families torn apart, the horrific destruction brought by the devastating earthquakes in southeast Türkiye on February 6th, 2023, and the aftershocks that continue to bring havoc to the region. Our hearts go out to all those affected and to everyone in Türkiye as the whole country and the world mourns, sends aid and support to the region. These current events make our archaeological work seem a bit insignificant and irrelevant, but maybe we can learn a little bit about ancient earthquakes from Sardis. We've seen how this sector is framed by 2 disastrous earthquakes. The sanctuary of the imperial cult was built after the earthquake of 17 AD, when Sardis and 11 other cities were destroyed. But Tiberius, the emperor of Rome, quickly stepped in and offered relief, and the Sardians rebuilt their city. They constructed a new imperial bath and gymnasium complex at the edge of the city. They rebuilt the theater and added a stadium. They repaired the Temple of Artemis and probably at this point dedicated the eastern half to the imperial cult. And they gave over the whole city center to this enormous neocorate sanctuary of the imperial cult with its lavish temple and plaza. The work took a generation or two, but it left Sardis a great metropolis. In return for the help given by the Roman states, the Sardians renamed their city, temporarily at least, the Caesarian Sardians. They renamed a tribe of the city Caesares, and they dedicated in Rome a huge statue of the emperor surrounded by personifications of the 12 cities whom he had aided. A statue base derived from this monument was found in Puteoli and is now in the Naples Archaeological Museum. In the aftermath of that earthquake then, Sardis was completely rebuilt. They established a new urban landscape that would last for the next 600 years. And from an archaeologist's point of view, nearly every trace of the earthquake was erased. We don't find piles of rubble or because the city was cleaned up and rebuilt. The earthquake 600 years later, however, was a completely different story. We found traces of this quake throughout the city. The Temple of Artemis collapsed, as did the houses that occupied the former sanctuary of the imperial cult, the Bath Gymnasium complex, the enormous arch, the Byzantine shops, and elsewhere. This time, there was no reconstruction. The ruins were left where they fell. Sardis, like much of the Roman world, had been weakened by decades of drought, disease, incompetent rulers, and a host of other problems. And rather than rebuild as they had in the time of Tiberius, they left the ruins in place and moved elsewhere. Here at Field 55, as we saw, the earthquake that destroyed the late Roman fortifications and split the terrace to a depth of more than 8 meters below modern ground level. The house that we were digging was abandoned, and so we don't find many artifacts or anything. But beneath the rubble elsewhere, we found those wonderful things, swords and so forth, preserved, like at Pompeii, by a terrible natural disaster. We've recovered parts of at least 4 victims of the earthquake from the rubble, 3 adults and a child, here identified by Professor Yilmaz Erdal of Hacettepe University. The earthquake can be dated by coins to the early 7th century BC. The latest coin here is 612, but at other places it's about 616 AD. We're still trying to determine whether there was one earthquake or more than one. It could have been a series of events. And I should mention that in the early years of the excavation, Clive Foss, professor here at Harvard, wrote a very influential article that the catastrophic destruction that they were seeing at Sardis in the excavations at that time was caused by an invasion of the Sasanian Persians in 616. In this article, the Persians in Asia Minor and the end of antiquity is still very frequently cited. But at Sardis, at least, there's no evidence of battle, and of course the Persians didn't cause those fissures in the earth. So we're rethinking our history of Sardis in the 7th century. The Persians, of course, may have come to Sardis, but perhaps because the city was already gravely wounded by natural disasters. Many other cities in western Türkiye were destroyed at just this time. Laodicea, Hierapolis, Aphrodisias, maybe Ephesus, maybe Miletus, and others. And like at Sardis, at these cities, archaeologists find collapsed buildings, seismic faults splitting the ground, and other traces of an earthquake in the early 7th century. This was not then a local, but was a regional disaster, and the recent events make it easier and more horrific to visualize the plight of the victims who were so much less prepared for this catastrophe. And like at Sardis, there was no rebuilding afterwards. The remains were not cleaned up, and the character of urban life in Western Asia Minor was changed forever. It was, as Clive Foss put it, the end of antiquity. One really puzzling thing about this earthquake, though, is that it doesn't seem to be attested in the ancient sources. There have been lots of studies and lists of ancient earthquakes, and people have combed through those records pretty thoroughly, and yet I at least have not been able to find one mentioned in the literary sources. The archaeological record is perfectly clear and I think can't be doubted. I have no explanation for this, and I'd be very grateful for ideas. We're very lucky also to be working with geophysicists Mahmut Drahor and archaeoseismologist Ukmen Sumer of 9th of September University in Izmir, who have been working on this problem of the ancient earthquakes at Sardis. In the past 2 summers, they've been using geophysical techniques like electrical resistance tomography to measure a series of deep sections, those colorful plans that you see there go 50, 70 meters deep or so, through the site, and thus plotted the main fault line that goes deep into the earth. The little cracks that we find in excavation seem impressive, but they're just little fissures. They identified the fault running right through the center of the city, and we're beginning to appreciate how much more fully, how its geology and seismicity affected the basic urban structure of Sardis. They are off now working in the southeast on that fault system, but I hope that they'll be able to find time to join us again this summer. It was not the end of life at Sardis, though. We saw how the earthquake debris, the fallen columns and masonry were preserved in the center of the courtyard, but around the edges, the debris and marble pavement too had been cut through by later people, survivors apparently digging to extract marble blocks from the floor, basins, and other features. And this is important new evidence for occupation at Sardis during that little-known early Byzantine phase after the earthquake, when most of the city was abandoned. These salvagers left behind a number of wonderful artifacts: a lead seal of Marturios Metropolitan, identical one in Dumbarton Oaks, dated to the 7th century, a silver-plated bronze buckle found deep in the salvage pit, and 2 Byzantine lead amulets that Francis has talked about here. These show, Francis Gallart Marquez, these show on one side a face within a circle surrounded by a cross with 8 snakes' heads radiating from them. Similar amulets bear inscriptions which identify that motif as a uterus, a womb, and it then are inscribed womb, black, blackening, as a snake you coil, as a serpent you hiss, as a lion you roar, as a lamb lie down. The other side shows the holy rider led by a saint and spearing a fallen female demon who's identified as Abidzu or Gailu, barren demons who can harm pregnant women and young children. Such amulets may be intended to protect the wearer from the dangers posed by the wandering womb as it was conceived in antiquity. Why would people need all that marble after the lower city had been destroyed? After the earthquake, it's possible that we know that the focus of occupation moved from the lower city to the Acropolis, and those walls on the Acropolis were built almost entirely with spolia from the lower city. They dismantled the Bath Gymnasium complex, the theater, the stadium, much of the Temple of Artemis, and parts of these buildings as well, and dragged those blocks up the Acropolis. They have not been extensively studied, however, until this recent survey begun in 2019 by Ben Anderson and Jordan Pickett, and continued last summer after a COVID hiatus. Among their projects last summer was to sample mortar from the walls for carbon-14 dating to try to determine the age of the fortification. I want to skip now from the Byzantine to the Lydian period. Those seismic faults, as I said, created this dramatic landscape of the city site, creating a series of steps or terraces coming down from the Acropolis to an intermediate zone about 100 meters above the plain, and then down to the alluvial plain where the lower city was set. The soft conglomerate erodes into fantastic shapes, making the Acropolis the strongest place in the world. And that intermediate zone between the Acropolis and the lower city is one of particular interest and has been the focus of excavation for more than 40 years. We've been excavating on 2 flat-topped hills called Field 49, which we're sort of zooming in on in the pan, and so-called Biz Fort on the right-hand side of the screen. When we first dug these hills in the 1980s, we thought they were outside the Lydian city and maybe they were extramural sanctuaries or something. Now that we know that they form the center of the Lydian city, we're developing the hypothesis that they represent the palatial center of the Lydian kingdom. One of the most striking features of urbanism at Sardis is the way the Lydians enclosed natural hills with high terrace walls, restructuring the landscape, regularizing and organizing it, and transforming it into a series of gleaming vertical plains which echoed and modified the sheer sort of undulating cliffs of the Acropolis behind. This radical transformation of the natural landscape is something Greeny talked about a great deal and is quite unlike the contemporary Greek urbanism. So we've been trying to learn more about these terraces by excavating on the slopes of Field 49. Like everything at Sardis, though, this is harder than it seems. It was the city center for 1,000 years after the Lydians. In order to reach Lydian levels, we have to dig through and dismantle late Roman, early Roman, Hellenistic, and so forth. All of it very interesting and important, but not something I can discuss in this lecture. Moreover, the Lydian architecture here is made of finely cut limestone and marble blocks, which are very desirable for building later buildings, and so later people systematically dig them up to reuse them. And so we find just pits where there used to be monumental walls. In 2017, we were very excited when Julia Judge uncovered a small stretch of beautiful limestone masonry still in situ, the kind found in elite terraces and just what the palace should be made of. Just as exciting was a little red patch of burned floor dating to the middle of the 6th century with 3 arrowheads on it that we thought might conceivably be the remains of the Persian sack in 547. And you remember that this was one of the other great catastrophes that Sardis suffered when Cyrus the Great conquered Croesus and changed the course of world history. We've excavated that layer elsewhere at Sardis, as I said, and found wonderful artifacts and even casualties, soldiers killed in battle and discarded with a thick layer of destruction debris. It's a sort of Lydian Pompeii, then, documenting the last moments of the Lydian city. One of those soldiers, as I said, had that tiny coin with him. On Field 49, however, we haven't had that kind of luck. We find small pockets of destruction debris with a few human bones, interesting elite artifacts in them, metal vessels, ivory inlays and ornaments, a jasper seal, weapons and armor, but all of it is churned up and disturbed by later robbing. On the one hand, these valuables help identify this area as a fundamentally different and elite zone of the city, and on the other hand, it's disappointing to find the area so badly plundered. The hint of a better preserved destruction level was a strong draw then, and Will Bruce then spent a number of years removing a complex series of Hellenistic walls and floors, and then of course we got the pandemic. But in 2021, we were finally able to expose more of the Lydian wall and in front of it, the Lydian destruction level. There's very little collapsed mud brick or fill to protect the floor. It seems to have lain open to the elements for those 350 years, and Hellenistic occupation is just a few inches above the Lydian level. So we don't find lots of pottery and other artifacts that we had in other destruction contexts, and I really didn't expect very much to come of this excavation, to be perfectly honest. But of course I was wrong. Will found a scattering of arrowheads, about 30 on the floor in this very small area, the result of intense battles. And on the next to last day of excavation, Will phoned and said and told me to come out, that he'd found a little bit of bone. He texted the photos to anthropologist Yilmaz Erdal, who confirmed that they were human, little teeny things like this, right? And a little bit later, he started to find more fragmentary and very burned bones. And you see him here excavating the bones, and at this point, one of the workmen noticed something different in the dirt. Sadly, I turned the video off at that point and went to look at what they'd found, so I missed Will filming Will's explosive joy and high fives as he realized that they had found 2 silver coins, large silver Lydian staters. A bit more cleaning exposed 7 more baby coins in a pocket of loose dirt, probably the remains of a cloth or leather bag that belonged to our sad casualty. The bones were very burned and shattered. Remember that this area stood open after the destruction, so it's kind of a miracle that anything survived at all. Yilmaz Bey could determine that this was probably a middle-aged male, but not much more than that. The find of the coins consists of 2 staters, 4 12th staters, and 3 tiny 24th staters weighing only half a gram. Found together with its owner in the historic context of the sack of Sardis, it's a really dramatic discovery and the first discovery of a group of Lydian coins found at Sardis since 1922. It took the whole summer of 2022 then for the team of conservators to remove that thick layer of corrosion from the coins, a long and painstaking process, since the corrosion is different on every coin and we can't just dump them in some chemical bath and risk losing critical information. What can we learn from these coins from such an excellent archaeological context? First, some scholars had doubted whether this type of coin was even minted under the Lydian kings, dating them instead to the Persian era. We disproved this some years ago, but it's nice to have confirmation by finding them again in this clearly datable context. And I should mention that the pottery from that destruction layer is middle of the 6th century. These then are some of the earliest silver coins in the world. When were the coins minted? I mentioned that the first bimetallic gold and silver coins is associated with King Croesus, and that Herodotus says that this king ruled for only 14 years. This would then date these coins to a relatively short period between 561 and 547. But a recent article, excellent article, looks again at Herodotus' chronology and argues that his 14 years is a conventional number. He sort of makes it up, and points out that other historical evidence puts the beginning of Croesus' reign much earlier, in the 580s rather than the 560s. The wear on these coins then may add new evidence to this argument, and the conservators paid particular attention to this while cleaning the coins. Jack Kroll, who's here tonight, the numismatist who will publish these coins, is working to determine whether their wear is consistent with coins only 14 years old, or whether, as I think he believes, having spent his life looking at ancient coins, they must have been in circulation longer. And that would fit in with Wallace's earlier dating for King Croesus. We thus hope that we can contribute to the discussion of this critical date in Greek and Lydian history. It's also rare to find these small fractions, and in such a great context. Most ancient coins are studied in museum and private collections, bought on the art market and not from scientific excavation. And collectors in museums want big, beautiful, mint condition coins, not these little worn dits. The American Numismatic Society, for instance, has 61 Croesid coins in its database, but only one example of the smallest type here, the 24th stater, and only 2 of the median ones, the 12th staters. Because of the predominance of these large coins, therefore, some scholars have argued that the small change was very rare in antiquity, that the Lydians minted primarily large coins, which would have been worth too much to be used for everyday market transactions. They could be only used for large payments like wages for mercenaries, for instance. And that idea, I think, has been losing popularity as numismatists realize the importance of those tiny fractions. But such coins are still vastly underrepresented in the numismatic literature. But here we have lots of small fractions together with the bodies of ordinary people. And remember that we found a 24th stater on the skeleton of that soldier killed in that same battle. In fact, we found 4 casualties of battle so far, a little scraps of others, but 4 real ones. And 2 of them have had coins with them. It's not much of a sample, but still, I'm not anything like a numismatist, of course, but I'll be interested to see how this find will be used in understanding the origin of coinage and of the ancient economy. And Jack Kroll, Will Bruce, and others are writing an article now which we hope to finish before the summer. A short distance away was a fragment of bronze, probably hacked from a much larger object. It consists of about 5 sheets, perhaps both hammered and cast. One sheet shows delicate feathers of a wing, including long, straight flight feathers and shorter covert feathers. 2 other sheets are riveted together, and between the functional rivets are raised decorative rivets, showing that this was exposed and ornamental. The upper edge of one sheet is scalloped with points or arrows between the curves, and this has been folded over and bent in the destruction, obscuring the original form. The scale of the feathers and the thickness of the sheets suggest that this was part of a monumental sculpture, the first monumental Lydian bronze sculpture ever found, and perhaps was being broken up and melted in the looting of the complex, and one fragment just lost here. Its original form and location, of course, are unknown, but if it was set up near here, it might have belonged to some sort of a bronze winged guardian figure, like a sphinx or griffin, maybe set on a mud brick platform nearby, like winged sphinxes and griffins from Kerkenestah and other sites in the Near East. So we learned a lot about the end of the palace in 2021. Excavations in 2022 were aimed at primarily the earlier history of the Lydian palace by digging under that destruction layer. Will found at least 3 earlier phases of monumental architecture here. The Lydians were constantly sort of tearing down and rebuilding their palace. Those earlier strata don't produce the kinds of rich finds of destruction levels, but they give us a sense of the long history of the palace. Will reached levels of the late 7th century BC, maybe the time of Alyattes. For earlier levels, we'll have to dig deeper still, which we hope to do this summer. We think they'll be there since we found them nearby. And let me just briefly move north, and then we'll come back here for a moment. The north side of the hill was terraced with a wall of huge boulders, 45 meters long, the most conspicuous monument of Lydian architecture at the city site. Guzine Eren of Boston University, lately of Boston University, bravely dug on this hill for 9 seasons now, and just last summer finished her PhD thesis on these terraces. Part of her work has been in dating the monumental terrace wall, and she concludes that it was built in the 8th century BC. And this transformation of the natural landscape through terracing therefore goes back at least to the 8th century, before the time of Gyges, sort of the time of Homer and earlier, when the Greeks were living still in small villages. She worked to understand the Lydian buildings on top of the terrace as well. And unfortunately, like in the Central Trench, Lydian later buildings have been entirely robbed out to reuse their blocks. But in deep excavations in 2013, she found a substantial mud brick wall with gaps from massive wooden posts associated with sort of dull pottery that was hard to date, but clearly very early. In 2019, she located the corner of the building and so could reconstruct it as a square about 16 by 16 feet and continuing on 2 sides. You can see here how our 8th century terrace wall has cut through the mud brick wall, the mud brick building, so it must be earlier. And the thick walls and massive post holes suggest a tall and substantial structure, much more than an ordinary house. So this is a monumental building. I reported on this in my last lecture, and we haven't been able to dig more since, but we do have new carbon-14 dates which tell us what we suspected from the pottery, that this was built in the 9th century BC and destroyed in the late 9th or early 8th. Both of these monumental phases belong then to that mythological period of Sardis' history. They are, in fact, our earliest monumental architecture at Sardis, dating to that sort of proto-historic, mythological period, well before the Greek settlements were properly urbanized. And I want to emphasize that our historical records for early Sardis come entirely from outside sources, of course, from the Assyrians, who had no contact at all with the Lydians before the 7th century, and from the Greeks, who weren't even writing much before the 7th century. We've therefore tended to understand this sudden appearance of the Lydians in history as the result of the quick rise to power of the Mermnad dynasty of Gyges and his successors, and assume that since we don't hear much about them before that time, the Lydians can't have been all that significant, just a bunch of crazy stories like Heracles and Omphale. But the absence of evidence, of course, is not evidence of absence, and the archaeology is showing us that the Lydians were building monumental structures, terracing their cities, and holding feasts for more than 100 people in this region as early as the 9th or early 8th century. Each year we find important new information about this critical early Lydian period, and we're slowly making progress towards a deeper understanding and I think an important reevaluation of the Sardis in the early Iron Age. We've been finding even more unexpected evidence for early monumental architecture in that Central Trench. Remember that Strabo says that Sardis was founded only after the Trojan War in about 1200 BC. Will Bruce then dug 2 deep sondages into the Lydian terracefill to learn more about the artificial terracing of this hill. He dug through 5 meters of sand and gravel, brought in to raise the level of the hill in the 6th century, the time of Alyattes and Croesus. But beneath that, he found occupation levels of 1,000 years earlier in the Bronze Age, with these unusual nosed pots and other characteristic shapes of the 2nd millennium BC. He excavated a meter and a half of occupation levels in this tiny sondage and found that beneath that was another 4 or 5 meters of almost sterile gravel, sloping down steeply to the west, very similar to the Lydian terrace fill above. That is, he had found the fill of an earlier terrace and showed that the hill had already been terraced in the Bronze Age. Eventually, 14 meters below the surface, the height of a 5-story building, he reached bedrock, sloping steeply down to the west, so steeply that the hill couldn't have been inhabited without monumental terracing. Pottery from this sondage dates to the early Bronze 3B period, about 2000 BC or a little earlier. It's the first time we found stratified Bronze Age pottery at Sardis, so we don't know the shapes and phases all that well. Again, I reported on this in 2019, and we've confirmed this through carbon-14 analysis lately, which tell us that the terrace really is early Bronze 3B, a bit earlier than 2000 BC, and that the occupation levels date from about 2000, down to about 1500 BC or so. So we're forced to abandon Strabo's claim that Sardis was founded after the Trojan War in 1200. We have occupation 1,000 years earlier. And not just occupation, but monumental terracing. The deep terrace fill implies that just as the later Lydians reshaped their landscape through terracing, so did their Bronze Age predecessors. And just as later Sardians in the Roman period lived in an ancient landscape and could point to great monuments of their ancestors which shaped the city that they lived in, the Lydians inherited an already built environment. In order to expand those excavations into early Sardis, we started excavation a few years ago on a lower terrace on the western side of the hill. Geophysical survey revealed a very deep anomaly. You see it there, almost 3 meters deep. Huge walls extending down, which we hoped would reflect something early, Lydian or maybe even earlier. We started an excavation in 2018 and 19, and then the pandemic, of course. And what we found then was meters of earthquake debris, dense, partly articulated masonry fall covering buildings that looked quite late Roman. It looked very much like what was going on in Field 55, and it seemed likely that that was the same 7th century event. However, we kept finding little bits of much later pottery, that Byzantine green glazed ware. It wasn't easy to tell whether the sherds were intrusive, later stuff which had somehow slipped in, and that happens, or whether we were really dealing with a much later Byzantine event. Last summer, we got the definitive answer. The buildings are Byzantine. They may be late Roman in their original construction, but they somehow survived the earthquake in the 7th century and continued to be occupied for centuries. The spaces are filled with Byzantine graves, something like 19 of them, most of which we left unopened until the anthropologists can dig them properly. And much more Byzantine pottery, coins, and a rather nice Byzantine processional cross. We left most of the graves unopened, as I say. The few that we did excavate are typical of Byzantine burials at Sardis, and 2 gave us carbon-14 dates in the 11th century. And we have coins of that period as well. Some of the pottery is probably as late as the 15th, 6th, or 16th century, suggesting many centuries of use until it was brought down by a different earthquake. Not the 7th century one, but maybe one in 1595, which is said to have spread widespread damage in the Manisa region. So this one trench then has produced almost 4,000 years of Sardis' history, from the earliest known occupation in the Bronze Age to the latest occupation in the city center, only a few meters away, and both of them completely unexpected. While we learn a lot from excavation, we're also deeply interested in the region around Sardis. Last summer, we started a new survey project of the Lydian cemeteries around the city. Lydian Sardis was unusual in having cemeteries scattered for many kilometers to the south and west of the ancient city, often in the form of chamber tombs dug into the living rock. Howard Crosby Butler dug about 1,000 of them between 1910 and 1914, but his maps and other records have largely been lost. So a team led by Susanna Ebbinghaus of Harvard and Annetta Alexandridis of Cornell, with students Leila Urer and Okan Emre Güney, took on the daunting task of walking the steep hills around the site. This path shows just a few days of wandering in late June and July, when they walked many kilometers and eventually recorded more than 300 tombs with high-precision GPS coordinates, photographs, and occasionally with 3D models, giving us, for the first time, a really broad view of the extensive cemeteries at Sardis. These chamber tombs carved into the soft bedrock formed underground rooms and sort of houses, each room often containing multiple couches to lay out the dead, and were used for many generations, for the early Lydian period, I believe, until the Hellenistic. The Lydians also equipped their dead with everything they would need in the afterlife: gold and silver jewelry, ornaments, seals, pottery, and other treasures. During the excavation of the tomb, the Butler expedition found thousands of these wonderful objects, certainly some of those beautiful objects found at the site. But in the upheavals of World War I and then Butler's unexpected death in 1922, many of these objects were left unpublished. One of the members of the Butler expedition, George Henry Chase, was given the task of publishing the pottery from these tombs. Chase joined Harvard University as a professor of archaeology in 1916, but then became involved in other excavations, and so in 1938, he gave the Sardis material to a newly arrived young instructor, not even an assistant professor, a refugee from Germany named George Hanfmann. Hanfmann worked on this material for years but became convinced that he needed, quote, at least one short campaign at the site, a short summer campaign of small scope. Hanfmann went on to direct, as you know, 18 seasons at the site, Greeny another 32 years, but Chase's pottery remains unpublished. This survey, then, is part of a project to study and publish that material and so fulfill the obligation of generations of American archaeologists working at Sardis over the last century. It's an exciting project and the subject of another lecture. Anyway, I wanted to end with a little bit about our site conservation project in recent years. In 2018, we finished a 5-year project to clean the Temple of Artemis of a century of biogrowth using a technique developed there by conservator Michael Morris, whom you see on the left. This has been one of the most satisfying projects we've undertaken, returning the temple to its former rich glow. We've been working even longer on the synagogue. This is in the western part of the city where Professor Hanfmann began his excavations at Sardis. Hanfmann excavated and then restored an enormous bath gymnasium complex with a great colonnaded marble court located along a colonnaded avenue. In the corner of the bath, Hanfmann discovered a building which proved to be a synagogue, the largest in the ancient world. The synagogue was discovered in 1963, and it quickly became clear that this was a spectacular building. The entire floor was paved with carpet-like geometric mosaics, and the walls had been revetted with colored marble. No longer, unfortunately. A number of menorahs were found in the building, and inscriptions recording the dedication of bays of mosaics, panels of wall revetment, and other parts of the synagogue. The synagogue, I should emphasize, was discovered by David Gordon Mitten when he was a very young graduate student of Professor Hanfmann's. David worked at Sardis since 1959, went on to teach at Harvard for 43 years, and stayed deeply involved with Sardis throughout his life. David passed away in January 2022. But until the end, he could recount the names and life histories of every workman who had ever worked for him in all those years. He's deeply missed by all of us, by his colleagues at Harvard, and by the people at SART. A very real problem, though, that faced Hanfmann was what to do with this amazing building and its 1,400 square meters of mosaics. You couldn't lift them and move them to the local museum in Manisa because the Sardis synagogue was larger than the whole museum. They would disintegrate if you left them unexposed in the weather. Hanfmann could have reburied the mosaics, but that seems like a shame. It must have been a bit of a white elephant. So they decided to undertake a monumental restoration project, one of the great achievements of his years as director. He brought in the legendary conservator Larry Majewski of New York University to oversee the work and trained a team of workmen. They took aerial photographs and made reasonably good records of the mosaics using a high-tech method for aerial photos at the time, the Whittlesey bipod, the sort of ancestor of our drones. They then lifted the mosaics from the floor by gluing cloth over them and rolling them up, separating the mosaic tesserae, the stone tiles, from their mortar backing. They left them with a layer of cloth. This left them with a layer of stone cubes glued to cloth. They then set those tesserae into new reinforced concrete panels. They laid a concrete bedding over the whole synagogue and replaced the panels in their original locations on that concrete bedding. I should emphasize that this is not what conservators would recommend today, but 50 years ago, conservation politics or practices were very different. They reconstructed the walls and shrines and other elements with a combination of ancient and modern materials, re-erected the columns of the forecourt, and made concrete casts of some of the furnishings. When the project was completed in 1973, it was an extraordinary achievement, one of the very few ancient buildings that give you an idea of the original space, the furnishings, where you could walk safely on the original pavements, reset in modern reinforced concrete. And here Larry Majewski paints a cast reproduction of one of the inscribed panels. The originals of the inscriptions went to the Manisa Museum. The mosaics, though, were never meant to be left exposed to all that rain and weather, and over the past 50 years, despite the best effort of reinforced concrete, they have begun to deteriorate. Water enters through tiny cracks, causing the iron rebar within to rust and expand, which widens the cracks, causes further incursion. In 2008 and following, Kent Severson worked on places where the mosaics had cracked and reported that the rebar was still in pretty good shape, but it was deteriorating, would continue to do so until the whole building failed. And then we'd have to relift and reset the mosaics, a truly awful prospect. The only way to avoid inevitable destruction was to keep the weather out, and it was better to do so before the panels failed. So since 2008, a team of conservators and architects and engineers and archaeologists have met at Sardis and in the US to design a shelter to protect the mosaics. They designed a lightweight roof with a steel frame and curving trusses 22 meters long. This dancing roof on different levels, as architect Troy Thompson describes it, has alternating higher and lower sections to break the monotony and ensure good airflow. We investigated different designs and materials from polycarbonate to tempered glass, but in the end settled on a sturdy and translucent fabric which provides excellent protection, is lightweight, long-lasting, safe in earthquakes, and not prohibitively expensive. It took 10 years to design the roof, a couple more to get permission to build it, and in 2019, an extremely generous gift from Patrick Healy of Hellman and Friedman, facilitated by longtime Sardis supporter Osman Mardin, provided the financial backing for the project, and we were set to build the next year. And then, of course, it was 2020. But the pandemic was only a temporary setback, and in 2021, we started construction. A really ugly concrete beam on top of the reconstructed walls supported the roof, but this was carefully covered with a skin of masonry to match the original material, so you'd never know it existed. The curving steel trusses were assembled on the ground and lifted into place with an 80-ton crane. They stretched the tenting material over the trusses and added birds' netting and downspouts and gutters and all the trimmings. The roof was finally finished in November 2021. After more than a decade of work, it was incredibly satisfying last summer for the architects and conservators who designed the roof to finally see it in person, to come and hear the space. And it's very surprising how it's changed the synagogue. It's now a building rather than a ruin with an acoustic presence and a gentle light, not the glaring oven that it has been. The roof not only protects the mosaics, but provides a welcome shelter from the heat of the day. And those of you who have visited Sardis remember the synagogue as this sort of incandescent furnace, and now it's cool and breezy, a refuge for the hot and weary. We even got to crash test it during a torrential rainstorm, which happens increasingly often as climate changes, and the roof performed admirably, and we could identify a couple problems like overflowing downspouts that we could then fix. While we were building the roof, the team of women who had cleaned the temple so successfully used the same technique to remove half a century of gunk from the mosaics. This completely transformed them, and you can see in the upper right, the white tesserae had turned completely black from cyanobacteria, and after only partial cleaning, they've returned to their original brilliant colors. The soft light and careful cleaning then has brought out the lively colors of the mosaic, and the roof allows people to stay here and really look at them rather than fleeing the intense heat. This means, however, that they can take a leisurely look at the somewhat coarse restoration of the 1960s. On the right, you can see how concrete leaked through holes in the original mosaics, and even small areas in bright white cement break up the geometric patterns. In the 60s, these fills were needed to keep the mosaics from deteriorating. But now that the building is protected by a roof, conservator Michael Morris and Hiroko Karia have started a new project to restore the mosaics. Their goal is not to fill in the missing areas. You see on the left, this would be more new mosaic than original, but rather to cut out some of the smaller areas of modern concrete and replace them with new tesserae to draw together the patterns in specific locations. They trained a crew of local women in the ancient art of laying mosaic, how to cut the stones to shape and match the original patterns. They started simple with black and white and simple designs and will work up to colored, complicated patterns. And it's particularly satisfying to see the women of villages around Sardis continuing to contribute to their ancient site and taking justifiable pride in their work. In addition, the work attracts the attention of visitors to the synagogue, and this has become a kind of laboratory where visitors can watch the process and ask questions of the team. And the women, of course, are glad and proud to explain, and it's really a much more engaging experience than just visiting some old ruin. with the new roof, the synagogue has become a really pleasant and interesting place to visit. There was a photo shoot with the permission of the Ministry of Culture for a clothing company in Istanbul, and I love the contrast between the clothing fashions of Istanbul and the colorful village fashions of our local staff. And Turkish radio and television did a couple of interviews in August, which went a little bit viral. It's been a lot of fun. The women could continue to work under the roof until the end of October, as they did last summer, and we hope to have teams of workmen there working 6 to 8 months a year for maybe 5 or 10 more years. A long, slow, but satisfying project. Meanwhile, the publication of the synagogue by Andy Seeger is nearing completion. It's fun to talk about field work and new discoveries and so forth, but the real work and the important results of all our labors is in that final report. And here I want especially to call out editor Carrie Sullivan, who joined the Sardis expedition in 2019 and oversees the Sardis Reports and Monograph series. Since arriving, she and architect Brianna Bricker have published Fikret Yegul's Temple of Artemis, a 2-volume monster, and Andrew and Nancy Ramage and Gül Gürtekin Demir's final publication of sectors Hob and PC, another 2-volume beast. And now they're finishing up the synagogue, which Andy Seeger has been working on for something like 50 years now. 3 major projects in 4 reports in 4 years, which is not so bad. The synagogue is also the last legacy volume from Professor Hanfmann's years as field director, and we're all proud to be bringing that phase of publication to a close. All these volumes, of course, are freely available on our website. And now we can turn to publication of our more recent work, like this monumental arch that I mentioned earlier. That was an unexpected discovery of 2014. And turns out to be the largest Roman arch in the world. I'll wind up this lecture now and don't want to get into the details of its discovery and so forth, but the excavation found a great pile of marble blocks here at the western entrance of the city, collapsed in the earthquake. Excavation is essentially done. We'll dig more this summer, but now we're turning to publication and documentation, which is done by John Sigmeyer, undergraduate here. Since I've stubbornly forbidden them from lifting the blocks to draw them, I want to leave them in place to document that earthquake and the collapse. John took 17,000 photographs to make a super high-resolution 3D model using photogrammetry, which allows him to make precise drawings and studies of the blocks. Let me just return to roofing. Across the street from the synagogue is the Lydian fortification, whose discovery 40 years ago changed our understanding of Lydian Sardis. This has been under this ugly temporary roof ever since, so nobody, not even members of the expedition, can see this most impressive structure of the time of Alyattes and Croesus. The roof was never meant as a long-term solution, though, and we've watched the unbaked earth building slowly be damaged by humidity and rising damp. In the 1990s, we even decided that it was hopeless, and we planned to rebury it. But conservator Michael Morris came up with a plan to protect this as well, and the architects have designed a program of coordinated roofs over the synagogue and the Lydian fortification using the same architectural vocabulary. The synagogue was the easy one, and in building that, we worked out a lot of the problems that we would face across the street. So, for instance, where do we put the footings? And we figured that all out last summer with a series of sondages dug by Gencay Öztürk. Gencay's goal this time was to find nothing, and he did this wonderfully. The plans were submitted in the winter. We hope to hear from the Ministry of Culture really any day now that they've been approved and that we can start construction in the spring. This project is made possible by a generous bequest from William Collins Kohler, one of Professor Hanfmann's star students who worked at the site in the late 50s and early 60s, but remained interested in Sardis all his life, and his bequest will allow us to protect one of the major Lydian monuments of the site. Once that's done, we have lots of other big projects ahead to finish that area, to protect the face of the wall, and so forth, which we'll have to report on in future years. So we're now preparing for a busy season this summer of construction, excavation, research, conservation, and publication, and also starting new sectors and projects that I'm very excited about, which I won't bore you with now. I'm very happy to introduce here Alyssa Martinez, who joined the Sardis expedition in the spring of 2022. Some of you know her from her work at visitor services at the Harvard Art Museums, and she brings this wonderful calm competence and wide experience to the office. A final and very welcome development is that the Ministry of Culture in Ankara is preparing its application to UNESCO to nominate Sardis for World Heritage status. The site's been on the tentative list for 10 years or so, and they hope to submit it for permanent inscription next year. When this comes off, it will have a big effect on the numbers of visitors of the site, making site conservation roofing program even more important. So Sardis never fails to impress and excite and confuse me. From the unexpected discovery of an extra 1,000 years or so of prehistory, to the unknown earthquake that brought an end to the city in the early Byzantine period, to the lost beauty of the mosaics of the synagogue hiding under a coating of biofilm and baking heat, from monumental mud brick structures to tiny coins weighing less than 1/10 of a gram, the site has a diversity almost unlike any other. It's been a great privilege to be working there thanks to the ongoing support of the Ministry of Culture and Tourism of the Republic of Türkiye, and particularly to work with a team of such very talented and professional students, scholars, and experts, some of whom are here tonight. And I want to thank all of them, and especially thanks to you for your patience this evening. And I'm happy to answer questions, but I'm asked to, I guess there's a microphone that would go around so that people can hear.
Did the recent earthquake have any effect on the dig and your work in Turkey?
The recent earthquake, of course, affects all of us and everybody in Turkey. The actual shaking did not reach Sardis, so we're lucky in that respect. But.
Sorry, 1 second.
I really enjoyed the presentation. What has been the most unusual piece that you have found?
The most unusual what? Excuse me?
The most unusual piece that you have found, or a surprise to you?
We find so much weird stuff. I love that thing with the noses on it, and I don't think anybody knows what those are. There's a wonderful one in the Ankara Museum which has the bowl, and then there's this sort of glob on the bottom. People call them drums. I don't think they're drums, really. I don't know what they are. It's a fairly common late Bronze Age shape, so it's not unusual, but it's very puzzling. And of course, just finding it in and of itself is. But one could pick lots of different things. Those amulets those uterus amulets are very strange too.
Thank you for a wonderful talk, Nick. Do you have a specific objective for the excavation of Aliati's tomb in Bintepe?
If we get permission to do that, which is not a guarantee, this is the largest tumulus, one of the largest tumulus in the world, certainly the largest around us and the largest in Turkey. And it is simply open to the, it's accessible. So we want to protect it, first of all, and be able to seal it off and bring it under, so it no longer gets damaged. Repair it, because it's been damaged. The chamber inside, which I showed a slide of it, it's very beautiful. Repair that and eventually open it up for visitors, because people visit Bintepe and they hear about it. They can't see anything other than these piles. They can't see it. So I'd like for people to see it. If any of you have been to Gordian and seen the Midas Mound, where you can walk in and visit the burial chamber of the father of King Midas, it would be something like that.
All right, thank you.
Hi, thank you so much. This was so interesting. I have two questions. About the uterus amulets, those are really interesting, and I was wondering what you think the implications for them, for two of them being found there. Is there some sort of healing association going on at Sardis, like some kind of sanctuary, or maybe do you think they just happened to be there?
That's a really interesting question. Yeah, why two of them? Was it something? Are they used by this? Are they? They're very, very similar. One of them's much more worn than the other. And I'm not really sure, but Francis, who excavated one of them, is here and has thought about them a great deal. Francis, do you have any thoughts about them?
No. They were found in a post-earthquake fill, so it's really hard to say what they were doing. But it certainly is interesting that there's two of them.
Yeah.
They were being made close by. People were gathering and sharing their ideas that they were working at. It's hard to say.
Okay, thank you so much. Okay, my other question is unrelated. But so I didn't realize that the central area of Sardis wasn't reoccupied after the Persians came in. And so you mentioned that it still was a capital for the Persian Empire and that there was a garrison. So do we find any sort of Persian artifacts or iconographies, or how do we know that their Persian garrison was there? Is there military weapons, or is this mostly just like textual evidence?
Certainly lots of, all of our ancient sources tell us how important Sardis was in the Persian period, or
Right.
many of them.
I was just curious on the archaeological side of things.
Logically, we've got a fair amount of evidence. There's many of those graves, for instance, that Butler excavated date to the Persian period. It doesn't mean that the graves were dug in the Persian period, but there were the objects that were found in them. The sort of last use of them then would be in the Persian era, and gorgeous things which sort of span the range of Greek, Anatolian, some Persianizing things as well, in that wonderful sort of eclecticism that's characteristic of that period. We find it seems pretty clear from ancient sources and what one would expect that the major Persian occupation, the administrative occupation, was on the Acropolis. And the Acropolis preserves almost very, very little, even Roman and Hellenistic. It's all been obliterated by the Byzantine occupation. Although admittedly we haven't done enough excavation up there either. So there may well be stuff to find up there of the Persians, but we simply haven't found it. We have found some up on the Acropolis. And then there are settlements along the Pactolus, and Mr. Hanfmann found that stuff and found pottery and other materials of the later 6th and 5th and 4th centuries BC. So that was a center of sort of, decentralized and unfortified and not very monumental occupation, while in a big contrast to what was going on the Acropolis.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
As an architect with the 1961 and 62 expeditions, I had the privilege of measuring the Aliates chamber with Professor Hanfmann as we crawled in under really precarious conditions. But I also would just marvel at the progress that's been made under Professor Crawford Greenewalt, but especially recently under Professor Cahill and his incredible use of technology, current technology, that we just couldn't imagine at the time we were working back in '61. So it's a great tribute to him that he's taken advantage of that and really progressed forward, and hopefully will do so for many decades to come.